Good evening, everybody. I suggest that we start. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening for our fourth session in our Sustainable Development Cycle. In the broadest sense possible, I wish you all a warm welcome on behalf of ICOM France and all of the national, international committees and our partners involved in this project. We're going to be talking about research and training this evening, which is a topic that's very important for the life of our institutions. I just wanted to remind you that this session has been coordinated by ICTOP and will be moderated by Rita, Capurro and Hélène Vassal. I thank them both for their moderation. Thank you to ICOM France team, Anne-Claude Maurice, Alexia Makiné, which we can see, and Raphael Gosques, who will be taking notes for the end of the project. Thank you to the translators as well, so that you can listen to what is being said. Our translators will be translating into different languages and allowing us to communicate with one another. I also would like to thank our four speakers this evening. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We are delighted to have you with us. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Lina Tokila, the president of ICTOP, who has a few words to say. Lina, over to you.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you very much. And we are very pleased and happy to be a partner in this series of webinars called Museums Facing their Environmental and Social Responsibilities Towards an Ethical and Sustainable Model. And as you mentioned, today we will discuss training and research in the context of ecological responsibility. But before that, I will very briefly introduce ICTOP and its activities. Please, may I get the next slide? Our committee, ICTOP, which is the ICOM International Committee for the Training of Personnel, is one of the oldest in ICOM, founded in 1968. And our committee is a network of professionals who are engaged in education and training in the field of museum and cultural heritage. And our members work in positions in higher education, for example, in universities as teachers, lecturers, professors in museology or museum studies or cultural heritage or heritage interpretation or related disciplines. We also have members who work as experts in museum professions in museums, or members working in continuing training positions in diverse institutions and associations. We all have a shared interest in developing education to better meet the requirements of the museum cultural heritage sector in terms of curriculum and pedagogical models. We welcome museum heritage professionals and researchers to attend ICTOP conferences and workshops to share their good practices in education and training. And actually, one of our committee's main strategic goals is to organize annual conferences outside Europe as often as possible to better understand the local needs, for example, in museological issues. Next slide, please. Main annual activity for our committee, as I guess for all international committees, is to organize a conference on a current topic related to education. Nowadays, we in museum cultural heritage professions discuss how the curriculum or research topics should be relevant to the problems we are facing, like sustainability and ecological responsibilities. This year, ICTOP conference will be in Paraguay next November, and this is a joint event with 4 ICOM international committees, which is ICTOP, MPR, ICMA, Intercom, and ICOM Paraguay as our host. And the theme of our conference is museum leadership in climate action. So we are talking very relevant issues in November in Paraguay. We take part in different projects as full or associate partners, and here we see on the slide some examples. And the very last one, Charter, which is the European Cultural Heritage Skills Alliance, should provide us with the knowledge of necessary cultural heritage skills to support sustainable societies and economies as it completes its work. So this is a very important project in that sense, and I'm sure that it also, even it is about European level work, I'm sure it's very interested in a global aspect as well. And the next slide, please. And among ICTOP activities, we produce resources for the sector. As you see here, some examples of our recent publications, but also one which is published back in 2008. And this example of our publications, Museum Professions, a European Framework of Reference, is rather significant, and it was significant at the publication at the time it was published. It namely provided a reference of required education for certain museum professions. And it seems that we are now discussing the same theme again, the content of education, as our world has changed and the change must be responded to. And there are some, some other examples of our latest publications, which you will find on our ICTOP website. It's ictop.org. And the final slide, please. The last one, please. Oh, there should be some name. Yes, here. The ICTOP contact information for your information if you are interested in, for example, to get some additional information about activities, or maybe some questions to ask, or maybe you would like to join, please contact us. Here is our information, contact information. And I wish you all a very interesting webinar. And I would like to thank you all speakers as well, and our moderators. And I'm very happy that we have a good number of participants here. So I will turn on to Rita and Hélène. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena. I'm Rita Capurro, happy and proud to introduce this fourth webinar devoted to training and research. These two words, training and research, projected us towards the future, matching together the vision of the research based on reliable data analysis and experimentations useful to represent the scenarios and foresights, and the future of the professionals and the ones who are building their fundamental competencies to work in a museum, but also the ones who are involved in long life learning, facing new challenges and professions in museums. The social and environmental sustainability is a paradigm that faces us with an ideal that often is in open contrast with the third pillar of sustainability, the economical pillar. even the museum training in research, even in this field, we can find this kind of contradiction. Indeed, in the ideal world, the sustainability is a perfect balance of different ingredients, but in some cases, they aren't enough to create a dish that satisfies everybody. This is the case of my field of research and training in sciences of tourism, where the success of a museum is still measured with the number and internationality of visitors. Well, if sustainability is a trend word in training and more in research, I recall the words of an Italian geographer, Manzi, who said that sustainable tourism is an achievable oxymoron, but nevertheless a necessary metaphor. So, in this webinar, from different areas of the world, our speaker, our presenter, can introduce us to methods, research, training example that can transform this metaphoric and unachievable target in a real goal. So I leave the floor to Michela Rota. Michela Rota is an architect with a PhD in cultural heritage in the frame of science of sustainability and museums. She's very active in ICOM, in the working group of sustainability, and she has different experiences of research that are summarized very, very richly in her book published in 2022, Musei per la Sostenibilità Integrata, unfortunately not yet translated in other languages, but hopeful soon. And she collaborates in different training programs, and I leave her the floor to introduce us to the methods and research for sustainability. Thank you, Michela.
Thank you very much, dear all. Good evening. And first of all, I'd like to thank you, all the organizers, and for this invitation, and a special thanks to ICOM France and the president, Michela Rota, and to the board of ICOM ICTOP, Rita, obviously Capurro, and Lena Toquila, and Hélène Vassal. I'm very pleased to be here today, and in my presentation, I'll highlight some aspects related to research and museums. Please, next slide. And today, today museums look at sustainable development to encourage participation and action in a process of awareness and development of skills to generate social, for example, environmental, cultural impacts. And in several cases, there are also acting as vectors of change for sustainability, engaged on different topics that can be faced in a complex framework of integrated aspects. And these topics can be seen as a roadmap towards sustainability, with a range of approaches and opportunities, and facing the complexity of the contemporary challenges about social, climate, environment, it requires to reset the orientation towards many issues, and for the creation of a cultural ecology declined in all the fields of activity. And it's a path that follows criteria and actions both at the scale of the building, for the governance and for programs and activities, and in the relationship with communities and places, in terms of participation and activism to increase the relevance of museums in their local communities, and for the systemic change. Please, next. And the sphere of the topics is really huge. And here we have a framework taken from my book. I can only mention here only a few of them concerning, for example, the building and the energy systems, the climate control and design criteria for the reduction of the environmental impacts, or for the well-being of people, or for circular economy, the involvement of the public communities, and also partnerships and networks and many other aspects, and involving different professionals with different skills and knowledge on specific topics. Museums can develop and contribute to strategic research, and then to systematic projects for sustainable development. And they can create, through research, tools, actions, programs, and good best practice that can be applied to different contexts, not only cultural contexts. And all these topics can be object of a specific research, because they are really there's really a huge need of new ideas and new visions. Please, next. I can mention only here, for example, one of the fields in which museums are starting to be active, for example, is citizen science. And the citizen science projects empower volunteers, often without any scientific training, to take part in research projects. And they might be asked to translate documents or help with observations. And there are opportunities for everybody. And for example, to support the work of scientists and create new knowledge by collecting mosquitoes, watching the sky at night, or describing works of art. And the greatest advantage of citizen participation in scientific research is the production of large amounts of data and info. And without the contribution of volunteers, it would be impossible to monitor extensively and constantly animal movements or climate changes. And people can contribute through the data collection, for example, through apps that monitor pollution, such as Noise Tube for noise pollution, or photo sharing, such as for species monitoring with iNaturalist or NATHIST. Please. But citizen science, it's not free from criticism in the scientific community, especially regarding reliability. And several authors argue that people without scientific training could collect or process data in a way that introduces errors. And for this reason, it's essential that citizens are correctly informed about what is required. And museums at this point can help organize these trainings and share also the links on and info on citizen science projects. Please, next. I have brought here an example of the Science Museum in Trento that has sustainability at the core of all actions, and one of its tasks is to interpret nature, starting from the surroundings and mountains, for example, but not only, using the eyes, tools, and application of scientific research, giving value to science, innovation, and sustainability. Please, next. And MUSE, Science Museum in Trento, is a research center also, and with the internal researchers, and also the museum promotes citizen science projects. Here, what I'd like to highlight is that MUSE is interested NATHIST with other science museums, but not only, also art museums and other kind of museums, in building an international network of competence on citizen science, in the shape, for example, of the European Citizen Science Association, and they are open to new collaboration on citizen science. So this is also a call for people on air, maybe who can be interested to collaborate with museum. And please, next. Again, now I like to say something about the methodology of the research. This is a proposal, and I think that it's really important of having a circular approach and a circular process with an integrated, related to integrated sustainability, where all the topics can be involved, defining the needs, defining the topics, create a path through participation, and also develop tools and programs, test all the process, and again, restart from the beginning, because sustainability is a path, it's not an end. And in the end, we can have different outcomes, best practice, guidelines, KPIs, projects, and programs. And thank you. Next. In the last part of my presentation, I like to talk about an Italian research project called Musei Integrati, promoted and financed by the Italian Minister of Ecological Transition, and it's a project coordinated by MUSE, the Science Museum in Trento, with the participation of ICOM Italy and the National Association of Scientific Museums. And the research, please, next. The research project has different targets and has the aim of implementing and promoting the application of the National Strategy for Sustainable Development and the SDGs for Agenda 2030. And the museum, the Musei Integrati project intends to create a platform for discussion, exchange of practices and research with different outcomes on sustainability, and to integrate the activist museum within the urban agenda for local development, to promote museums as civic and cultural platforms in close relationship with institutions and citizens. And also it's related to the concept of the extended museums. Please, next. And to achieve these targets, the research is organized around a methodology that involves different activities. We started from MUSE, but we developed the research with 30 Italian museums, and the activities are related to a survey addressed to all the 30 participants, and with more than 100 questions aimed at highlighting the work already carried out in the field of sustainability from museums and by museums. And the survey can be used also as a self-assessment, and we would like to create a tool helping museums to develop an annual sustainability report of their activities. We developed 5 workshops and also a repository of best practices that museums have undertaken on the different fields in connection with the SDGs. And the mapping of best practice has been used by the researchers to monitor the progress of the main initiatives present nationally, and to highlight trends or signals of interest. Please, next. The 5 workshops were aimed at deepening research topics and developing new ideas for the museology of sustainability. And the workshops had a training session, a master class at the beginning, and carried out by experts, and followed by focus groups to deepen and discuss the issues. The main topics of investigations were related to future studies, Anthropocene, climate justice, and the engagement of young activists for the environment and climate. And the workshops highlighted where museums need more focus. Please next. And related to the guidelines, it was really an interesting project and moment of the research, because we had the participation both of museum professionals and young people or young activists for the climate and the environment, who worked together to create these guidelines around these keywords. I don't want to read all the words, keywords. You can have the PowerPoint later, but it was really interesting, and we have the guidelines also translated in English, available in English on the web ICOM Italy website. So if you are interested in this project, because it's very interesting to have young people on board participate in museums activities. It's a very important moment. And please next. One of the goals of the Musei Integrati project is to inspire more museums to embrace sustainability and the SDGs and promote best practices, also taking care of cultural and natural environment with their communities and other stakeholders. And to reach this goal, the participants highlighted the importance of dialogue and of creating a lasting network of the discussion around sustainability. And the museum professionals involved agreed on the positive effect of the research and the creation of the network to share and listen to the different experiences, to overcome the critical points encountered and open up to new ideas to face the contemporary challenges. For the future, we would like to enlarge the number of museums involved in the activities, and in particular for the training sessions, the focus groups, and the survey, to develop a museum ecosystem that can continue over time and be implemented thanks to the partnerships also with other institutions which deal with local innovation, policies, education, social urban planning and design. And we are developing a new project called the Musei Integrati Open, in a continuous process of testing and implementation. Please next, the last one. So I think that this research can be applied in other contexts, and we are open to new collaboration and to try to develop new research projects, implement them together with other ICOM committee or research centers. So thank you very much, and we are here, and hopefully we hope to collaborate again in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michela. This very interesting presentation introduces us to the connections between museums, research, academic, training that can go alone. Is all an integrated process that involves every part of a museum, and inside and outside. We'll leave the time for questions at the end of the session. And now I would like to continue the webinar with the second speakers, with Ernest Kpan.
Ernest is a museum creator for more than 10 years at the Musée National d'Abidjan. He obtained a PhD in Art, Culture and Development in 2018. Since October 2022, he's worked as a higher education assistant, a teaching researcher at the Institut National Supérieur des Arts et de l'Action Culturelle. He's the current president of the Ivorian section of the International Council of Museums, ICOM, Côte d'Ivoire, and has published several scientific articles in English and French. Ernest, over to you. Great, thank you very much. So the theme is on the training and museum research system in the context of sustainability in Ivory Coast. This is with a diagnostic and perspective for the future. So I'm going to break this down into 3 parts. Next slide, please. So 3 parts. First of all, I wanted to give you an overview of museums in Ivory Coast. And then I wanted to look at the training and research system around museums and culture. And thirdly, I want to just present the initiative that ICOM Côte d'Ivoire is involved in. So the first point is that, because I talked about this museum landscape in Ivory Coast. So we have museums in Ivory Coast, like in many other countries. But if I look at the history of museology, which began in Senegal in terms of West Africa. Museology really began here in Senegal, in Dakar, with Kpan, which is the French Institute for Black Africa, which was created in 1938. But in 1966, it became the Fundamental Institute of Black Africa. And it was out of a subsidiary of ICOM in Ivory Coast in 1942 that the first museum, the National Museum of Abidjan, was created, and conservation and museology started to take shape within Ivory Coast as a speciality. So now, in terms of museums in Ivory Coast, there are public museums and also private museums. In public museums, there are national museums, which are managed at a national level. They are managed under the responsibility of the national ministry. There are 2 big museums in Abidjan and another national museum in Grand Bassam. Grand Bassam was the initial capital of Ivory Coast, and Abidjan is now the economic capital of Ivory Coast. And alongside these museums, there are private museum institutions and local community museums as well. So that gives you an idea of museums in Ivory Coast. So on this picture here, you can see the Museum of Civilizations. That's the main museum there. And on the right, on the 2 pictures here, you can see a local community museum, which is in the south of Ivory Coast. This is a museum that brings together culture and nature. And it's a really interesting example of a museum, and it's the sort of thing we want to see develop. So, as I said, museography in Ivory Coast is focused particularly on ethnography. We have 16,000 artifacts in our different museums with masks, statues, and signs of power and paraphernalia and costumes. So these are very are excellent. There's a real wealth of resources, and we need experts to work on them. So Ivory Coast has thought about training. We have institutes and even universities that have training and research units focused in on culture and heritage. So you have the National Institute, Higher Institute for Art and Culture in Abidjan, and this has trained many of the professionals in museums in Ivory Coast today. But before the institute, training began in 1962 in Nigeria, Niamey, and training slowly moved to Ivory Coast from other countries in West Africa. So we'll move on to keep talking about this. There are 7 institutes of research that are in operation today, but there are not enough. It cannot meet all of the needs in terms of the issues around the protection of museums and collections. We consider that these museum organizations are insufficient in number. Programs are not really, training programs are not really open to sustainable development dynamics. Yes, there are professionals who travel and take part in ICOM training courses. ICOM does a lot in terms of continuing training for museum professionals throughout Africa, because 30 years ago, in 1991, there was a big workshop around 3 countries, which included 65 different communications over a 3-day period. It was in Ghana, Benin, and Togo, and this workshop covered a whole number of questions linked to training, research, and funding. So what I mean is that ICOM has done a lot, but at a national level in Ivory Coast, the dynamic that we encounter linked into sustainable development is not sufficiently developed. The third point in terms of training organizations is that there is a lack of educational partnerships on sustainability issues. We wanted there to these training organizations and universities to focus in on sustainability. But this is not yet the case at the level we have desired. And the fourth point is that research infrastructure needs to be specialized and adapt to current world issues such as sustainable development and digital technologies. So in the light of this, our national committee, ICOM Côte d'Ivoire, has been at work. Since 2021, the new team, it's at that point that I became president of ICOM Côte d'Ivoire in January 2021. We've been working hard since then. Since Prague, which was in 2022, my team has been looking to move things forward at a national level. So ICOM Côte d'Ivoire has taken part in a dynamic way in a whole range of sustainable development processes. We know that the ICOM Secretariat in Paris is really active in this area. So at the national level, we are looking to relay these initiatives and activities. We're organizing activities ourselves, and we're also involved in activities organized by the state. We know that from the 9th to the 20th of May 2022, Ivory Coast held COP15, and some important resolutions came out of that COP event. ICOM Côte d'Ivoire took part in and shared in the fruit of the decisions and directives that came out of that conference of the parties, and this was a big meeting focused in on sustainable development. This is a program linked into Ivory Coast, and in the context of this situation, we're suggesting a system for studying and training around museums. So we are calling this museums deeds. We want there to be deeds or actions. We want museums to be working on this question of sustainability. So next slide, please.
Museum deed to us means a mechanism. It's a mechanism that needs to take into account the wealth, the data collection, with an exhaustive report on giving a kind of identity card for community museums. It's also going to include a session for capacity building of professionals in order to share scientific documentation that is accordant with international standards for facing up to sustainability challenges. There's also a matter of advocacy in order to have suitable measures to introduce a sustainable development approach. This is a dynamic country with a dynamic economy, and we're building a lot of infrastructure at the moment with roads, bridges, sporting infrastructure, and cultural infrastructure as well. There are cultural centres and museums that need to be built or retrofit. And we are therefore doing advocacy work to ensure that sustainable development is integrated into all of these projects. Next slide, please. We believe that the mechanism needs to include the implementation of a consultation framework for studies and the assessment of projects for redesign, architecture, building, and the retrofit of museums and the design of exhibitions in accordance with the sustainable development approach. It's also about creating what we call the Museum Sustainable Development Alert. This is with research, data analysis, and then communicating this data in line with museums' corporate social responsibility. We think that it would be interesting to propose a digital exhibition, a digital visit of Ivorian collections that's pooled across all community museums. I'm insisting a lot on this term community museums because we want to get communities involved. And earlier I was talking about this pact that government passed recently. Sorry. Next slide, please. Alongside this mechanism that we've called deep, we decided to go deeper and with a more exhaustive approach, with a sustainable development approach, which we've called durability.lab, sustainability.lab. So this will be a building for scientific research, analysis, and exhibition planning. This lab will be built in the city of Bonua. The initial studies have been carried out, and the estimated quote of construction and outfitting is 185,000 euros. We will be looking for partnerships from UN Environment, UNESCO, the Agence Française du Développement, GIZ, which is the German Development Agency, the National Center of Remote Detection and Geology, SODEXAM, which is an Ivorian organization for sustainable development. So they are excellent at geographic information systems, and their methodology is very impressive. And also the Ministry of the Environment, Ministry of Culture. And these are potential partners that we have considered. This sustainability project for museums is something that ICOM Côte d'Ivoire is working on at the moment. We hope to be including all national and international partners in order to give museums a responsibility in the light of sustainability in Ivory Coast. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to stop there.
Merci, Ernest. Thank you very much for your presentation, perfectly on time. And this very interesting presentation introduced us to the theme of contemporaneity, where the birth of new training program is interconnected with the research and with the sustainability topic that is central and relevant for all professions, not only in museum. Thank you, Ernest. At the end of the session, we'll see if we have some questions for you. And now I leave the floor to Hélène Vassal, who can introduce the second part of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rita. Thank you, Ernest and Michela, for your very informative presentations. I'm going to say a few words to introduce the rest of this evening. As you know, the conservation of heritage is being reconfigured in order to reconcile professional practice and issues associated with sustainable development and the need to preserve museum objects. The energy transition has been generating new uses and new professions, new forms of management and skills in cultural engineering. It is challenging traditional working methods, generating the construction of new measuring tools, promoting discussion around issues such as international lending conditions and sales, which we have seen in recent sale procedures. This is a matter for professionals, but also for elected officials, for the staff working in our museums. It's becoming an essential issue. We're looking for an in-depth overhaul within the sector, and training is at the heart, is the key to success. To introduce this second section, I would like to talk about a recent French study led by the Métiers de l'Avenir, Professions of the Future, with the support of a university based on a large number of professional experience, showing that training is not yet allowing us to raise awareness of professionals in this subject. We're going to need more in situ training on the sites themselves. And Ernest mentioned this in his presentation earlier. We need to give space to professionals on the ground and their skills. So we need to be promoting co-design approaches in order to show different ways of sharing information. And we've tried to identify new needs and new expectations for training. We should be promoting self-learning and mentoring, which is very interesting. And it is evident for all of us here that there are increasing demands for support at all levels. We have been training entire teams within our institutions. And the national study showed that we need leaders, we need more strategic training on overall management of museums, but we also need to promote specialization, such as technical directors or specialized positions in museums. And to achieve this, we need to have continuous education throughout all of these professions, which are going to be emerging with this paradigm shift that we are often reminded of. Manuela, I am now going to hand over to you. Manuela Maria Duarte is a researcher at the University of Liège in Belgium. You're a permanent professor in the social anthropology postgraduate program at the Federal University of Goiás in Brazil, and a guest professor in the sociomuseology doctoral program at the Lusophone University in Lisbon. You're a member of the board of directors of ICOM LAC, ICOM's Museology Committee for Latin America and the Caribbean, and a member of the organizing committee for the Conference of the International Movement for a New Museology, the MINOM, in Catania in 2024. And this evening, we want you to remind us to what extent these questions of training and research require cross-cutting approaches, even ecosystem approaches. Manuela, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good evening. Buenas noches. Bonsoir. First of all, my thanks to the organizers of this event. Thanks to Oda Porcheda and Rita Capurro for the invitation. My greetings to all the speakers and participants. In preparing this speech, I was reminded of a dialogue on social media. What is development? Adopting the Western way of life? To be developed is to be able to assign to others the place of the underdeveloped. After stages of hegemony and then criticism of the Western capitalist, ethnocentric and modern concept of development, other notions have emerged, such as local development and sustainable development. This is generally associated with the economic and environmental aspects, but I would like to focus on the social and cultural aspects, according to Ibermuseos, which is an organization that promotes Ibero-American museum heritage. The social dimension of sustainable development involves the fight to eliminate major social inequalities and therefore museums as promoters of social inclusion. As far as culture is concerned, the museum is committed to promoting cultural diversity and the local population as a link between past, present, and future. Sustainability implies cross-disciplinary, ecosystem-based approaches that are less rigidly based on classifications, thinking that research and training are inseparable. We learn by researching, and at the same time, research is all the more justified when its results are incorporated into training. At the same time, linking training and research to the practice of working in museums is essential for understanding museology as an applied social science, which is commonplace in Latin America, particularly where it is most influenced by the thinking of Waldizo Rusio. Sustainability has been the subject of recent resolutions in the museum world, and I would like to underline that. Approval of the recommendation on the protection and promotion of museums and museum collections, their diversity and their role in society in 2015. It recognizes the role of museums in learning, social cohesion, and sustainable development, and their contribution to the quality of life of the communities and regions in which they are located. The adoption of 2 resolutions on the issue of the ICOM General Conference in Kyoto 2019. Resolution number 1, sustainability and the implementation of the 2030 agenda. Resolution number 5, museums, communities and sustainability. This resolution, as stated in the book Eco Museums and Climate Change, organized by Borreri, Davis and Dal Santo, calls for greater recognition and support for community museums and eco-museums and their contribution to safeguarding, understanding and promoting access to natural, cultural and intangible heritage. All this culminates in ICOM's approval this year of the creation of an International Committee for Social Museology. Current events call for museums to adopt a different rationale, one that is more in tune with the challenges of climate change in society. Institutions brave enough to question their desire for infinite expansion, accumulation, voracity, and predatory practices. These issues are not new to the museum field. Let's recall a text by Hugues de Varine and Graça Felipe proposing a moratorium on the creation of museums, which was in the early 2000s, and the Morgan and MacDonald's article on the degrowth of collections. They are not, however, deeply incorporated into the training of new professionals, despite the fact that they are more aware than we are of global challenges. Social museology recognizes the power of museums and the need for people and social movements to appropriate them through participatory and counter-hegemonic processes. It pays particular attention to local museums, even though in Latin America it is capable of gradually influencing and transforming so-called traditional museums and national museums. Given that we think of training and research beyond the university framework, I have chosen to talk about the ICOM Museu Natural do Mangue, the Natural Eco Museum of the Mangrove in Fortaleza, Brazil. It was set up in 2001 by a small group of volunteers, including environmental activists and educationalists. It is now working to meet the SDG 4, Education for All and for All Ages, and SDG 13, Action Against Global Climate Change. It has already welcomed more than 1,600 school groups, with whom it conducts environmental awareness raising activities along routes that make use of around 10 stations identified in the mangrove swamp. At the end of the visit, the students plant seedlings of native plants, helping to replenish the mangrove, which is being impacted by various factors, such as pressures from property development. You can see from the photos that over time, the museum has obtained a lorry for touring activities and the reconstruction of a small space that is now called the collection room. But intuitively, they work with the concept of the operational collection promoted by Mathilde Belleg. This concept allows us to consider the entire heritage of this region as an educational resource for the museum and also as an object for its preservation work. It should be noted that although continuing education or partnerships with schools is at the heart of their educational work, the Eco Museum reports that it has already received 52 students from various university fields to carry out compulsory work placements, which attests to its involvement in higher education. As challenges common to both research and training, I would like to highlight the following. permanent renewal, overcoming disciplinary barriers and experimenting with ecosystem approaches. This is not foreign to the sectors of museology, particularly those influenced by eco-museology and by the concept of the integrated museum that emerged from the Santiago Roundtable. Daring to be open to new epistemologies. This means recognizing other relationships with reality, other ways of inhabiting the world. From the point of view of Amerindian cosmologies and epistemologies, the concept of sustainable development is not only contradictory, or at least immersed in tensions between two rationales, but it is also anthropocentric because it focuses solely on human beings. The indigenous Amerindian American Indian view rejects the ontological distinction between nature and culture, between humans and non-humans, and understands the existence of a community of life in which the various organisms demand sustainability, without this being subject to human needs through development. In this sense, it is essential to learn from the cultures of Abya Yala, the native name of what is known in the Western world as the Americas, about the notion of buen vivir. This is an alternative to development. So this is the notion of buen vivir, an alternative to development defined by Alberto Espinosa in his book Le Buen Vivir, to imagine new worlds, as the foundations of a harmonious relationship between man and nature, breaking with the degradation engendered by the economic model based on consumption and growth. In the university sector, at the new master's and doctorate level, a unique training program has been developed since 1993 at the University of Lusofona in Portugal, born out of close collaboration between professionals from Portugal and Brazil, based on the new museology and field experiments on both sides of the Atlantic. It now claims to be a school of thought, socio-museology. Its diverse theoretical influences combine Georges-Henri Rivière, John Kinnard, Paulo Freire, Hugo de Varine, Pierre Meyran, and contemporary decolonial thought. The dissertations and theses defended notably in Portuguese, but also in English and French, contribute qualitatively and quantitatively to adding a new critical mass in the museum field, with more than 60 theses that have been defended. The vast majority of these have been by actors on the ground who later left in search of reflection on their practice. Since 2018, the Department of Museology has also included the UNESCO Chair in Education, Citizenship, and Cultural Diversity. This very active chair contributes in particular to the democratization of access to knowledge through content available online in webinar formats and through publications such as Cadernos de Sociomuseologia. Those working in the museum sector outside the academic world will find it a rich source of self-learning. To conclude, one of the research projects has been called an ECO project. I do not have much time to talk about it, but it really does link into our topic today. And I'd like to wrap up now by encouraging you to continue dialogue and to get to know the real players in the field at the conference of the International Movement for a New Museology in Catania, Italy in February 2024. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Manuelina, for this presentation that helps us to look at museums from the different perspectives and prisms of sustainable development, and the perspective of diversity and museums of citizenships. What does a citizen museum mean? Can there be different types of eco-citizen museums in the way that you've presented to us so excellently? And then there's this central question of sustainable action on the ground with communities. And that is the theme that I'd like us to touch on now with Blaise Kilian, who's the co-director of the Museum of Economy and Money in Cambodia. And he's going to talk to us about reflection and initiatives in Cambodia and in the region that he's in. Blaise is co-director of the National Bank of Cambodia's Museum of Economy and Money. He's previously been involved in various public and private institutions in the fields of education, heritage management, and public-private dialogue, particularly in his former capacity as executive director of the European Chamber of Commerce. He has been on the board of several organizations, including ICOM Cambodia, ICOM and Cruseteme, an organization which provides education to deaf and blind Cambodian children, among others. He's a graduate from the Paris Institute of Political Sciences. He holds a higher education degree in applied economics and a university diploma in Khmer language and civilization. Thank you very much, and over to you. Thank you very much, Helen. I hope everyone can hear me. Everyone can hear me. Thank you to ICOM France and the organizers. So the presentation that I want to do is perhaps not quite connected to what we've been doing so far, but is about the role of museums in society and the conception of this role and how the understandings of this role are evolving in Cambodia. So next slide, please. So just as an introduction, I'd just like to remind us of the new definition of museum for ICOM, defined by ICOM in 2022, because it helps us to understand the limits of the museum sector in Cambodia and help us to see what we're doing to try and push back these limits and help Cambodian museums to play their role in society. So just a very simple plan of what I'm going to talk to you about today, just an overview, look at needs and then museum experiences over the last 15 years. And then the different actions that we're doing in terms of training. So just a quick reminder that in terms of the perspective on museums in Cambodia, since from the beginning, there have been some tropisms that have really marked the understanding of museums. And the first of these is the encore tropism, which is the discovery of Angkor and the creation of the first museums, and all of this focused on the Khmer in general, and focused very often exclusively on archaeology, and that's something that's really marked the museum sector in Cambodia. The second tropism is the tropism of the Khmer Rouge. How can we explain what's inexplicable in Cambodia? For a long time, there were two types of museums. Most museums focused on archaeology from before the Angkor period. And then some museums that sought to document the development of the Khmer Rouge and that whole episode of our history. So museum models remain fairly sort of classical archaeological museums focused on stone, and the skills that we have around museum professionals have to do with archaeology and the preservation of structures, and it rarely comes out much out of that area. In Cambodia, there's also a lack of museology training programs at university level. We have a fine arts museum which does good work in terms of the training, but the focus is primarily on archaeology, conservation, anthropology more and more, but there's a single module on museology as part of an archaeology diploma. There's no actual museology diploma and degree. And that's something that's important to understand. But for the moment, we're in a training course where museology is just a small part of something broader in terms of archaeology. So this is the National Museum. This is our first museum. It's more than 100 years old. And so if you go to the next slide, you can see a standard exhibition that we might have in Cambodia with statues. 80% of our museums are like this. There are a lot of museums in the provinces, but they're really considered to be archaeological storehouses, as it were, deposits. And so primarily these are archaeological reserves. And this is something that's very important, but it's perhaps just limited only to that. And most provincial museums are involved in this. There's not a lot in terms of skills apart from an excellent knowledge of dates and places. And then on the next slide, what you can see here is the Museum of Genocide, the Kpan, linked to the Khmer Rouge. And you can see a presentation here of a lot of the archives and work on interpretation and narration of this period, but which is also quite limited actually. So what are the needs in this context? So we need to keep in mind that needs were for a long time, that there was a need to reconstitute and redevelop skills because the Khmer Rouge and their regime annihilated all skills among a whole number of horrors that they enacted. So what we needed to do was redevelop skills with the remaining survivors that had not been massacred. And we had to redevelop skills in archaeology and conservation. And it's only recently when we sought to pass on new skills, you'll see that there's a number of new museums that are starting to be developed now. And there we're starting to think about new skills in terms of communication, narration, use of new tools, digital tools for communication, for managing collections. That's something that's quite recent and which it comes into a context where these skills, the older skills, have not yet fully been redeveloped and put in place. So we're thinking about contextualization, narration towards new audiences. A high percentage of the Cambodian population are under 25, and so it's important for us to have skills in terms of communication. And someone who's perhaps trained in archaeology or conservation doesn't necessarily have these skills. And what's really important is to change the perception of museums, including the perception of those who manage the museums, in order that we could focus more on audiences, visitors are not just collections and heritage. So here's some of what's happened over the last 10 or 15 years with some new museums that have arisen. So the Textile Museum, this is an initiative that was co-funded by the state. And here are collections that have been acquired from populations around Mekong. So it's a Cambodian and Indian project, and it's been about acquiring collections from communities in order to document the story of objects that are explored. And so this here we're involving local communities. This was launched in 2010, co-funding between India and Cambodia here for this project. The second attempt that I was actually personally involved in coordinating is the Ratanakiri Museum. This is about 10 hours from Phnom Penh, and it's focused in on indigenous populations in its area. And so we tried to create a museum which was designed as a cultural center, where we wanted to present the craftsmanship of the local population, show their way of life, and also create a place where local communities could come, indigenous peoples could come and put on cultural events, of course, on condition that local authorities and communities were able to communicate together. And that was a challenge because it required having a new concept of a museum, both in terms of the person that was responsible for managing the museum and in terms of the local communities, so that they might actually have the courage to come into these museums. So these are issues around mentality and conception, our concepts of things, and these are things that change very slowly. You can see here that we still have Angkorian stones in the center of the museum. There's a real sense that it's really important to have these stones even in an ethnographic museum. And then the third initiative that's really been very interesting that started in 2018, or launched in 2018, but it actually started a long time before that. It's the Priya Via Temple Museum, which is part of the World Heritage. And here we wanted to create a kind of local museum. It's a kind of, you can see an ethnographic room as there is here, and then a room focused on flora and fauna in the area, and another room focused on the history of the area. And this is the first time that we had a museum that tried to focus on these different sectors in connection with local communities, once again, because all of these objects have been collected from local communities. And then the final example I want to show you is the next slide. So here it's the same museum. It's something else apart from stone and statues, so that's good. And the final example is the Museum of Economy and Money, and this is an initiative which goes even further in terms of the concepts that we talked about. It's a very modern museum, an interactive museum with narration. There's a narrative of the economic life of the country over 2,000 years, and now we're no longer just focusing on objects, but we're talking about the whole history of Cambodia, which is something that's very interesting, but at the same time, there's quite a risk here. It's a museum that presents visual documents, touch screens. There's a real interaction with visitors. So you can see school children that are testing their knowledge in terms of through the interactive screens at the museum. And then the National Bank regularly organizes events outside the capital city in order to encourage the use of local currency at each of these days that are organized in the provinces. The museum takes part. We transport our exhibition and we summarize content and the exhibition. We don't transport the objects, but we take visual media in order to communicate that. And here we have pupils and students, again, learning about local currency, about the history of their currency. And this is something that makes it possible to meet local communities. And once again, it's a new approach, which would not have been possible a few years ago. And it's interesting to see that this is 100% funded by the Cambodian government, but it brings together local and international expertise, which helps us to move forward the thinking into the museum sector. So these museum experiences show that it's possible to develop and change the understanding of museums in terms of visitors, but also in terms of museum professionals. These adaptations involve new challenges in terms of human and material resources, because in order to do this, you have to develop new skills, acquire equipment, and it leads to costs that are unusual for museums. And sometimes it's difficult to find the funding and skills necessary, since these activities are not part of the traditional understanding of what a museum is. In order to round off in terms of work we're doing for training, so I've shown you how museums can change. Of course, we're working a lot in terms of training and skills training. We've done that a lot with the support of UNESCO, and particularly in terms of translating documents in terms of the management of museums in Cambodia. Also thanks to ICOM Cambodia and the Culture and Fine Arts Ministry, we've managed to set up a system where we can transfer skills between museums. We don't have experts in Cambodia. We have the experts within our different museums. We have international experts that we've employed as part of international cooperation programs. And then we have some individuals who've developed their own concepts on the basis of training experiences. And we're trying to bring all of that together in order to communicate and transfer the skills that we have developed. And in order to develop skills and also develop and encourage the evolution of the understanding of what museums are. Museums are not just places for conservation, but they're also places which are responsible for holding knowledge and communicating knowledge to local communities. And this is something that needs to be clearly in the mind of the person who manages the museum. They're not supposed to be just an archaeologist or a curator, conservator, but they need to be focused on communicating the knowledge that they have. So here are some examples of training documents that we have, and here we have museum managers from around the country who come to listen to their colleagues who are sharing their experience and skills on simple questions linked to conservation, collections, but also communication and access to local communities and the involvement of local communities. Here's a young man who was trained in England. He's opened his own art gallery. He's communicating to staff from different museums, and so you can see that this is someone who's gifted in terms of training and in terms of communicating with young people. But you can see on the right there are people that are trained into really in archaeology. So the goal is to allow Cambodian museums to play their role in serving society and not simply to conserve heritage and collections. So very briefly, that's what I can say about the Cambodia's experience. Thank you very much, Blaise. Emily, have we got time for a question? Yes, we've got 4 minutes since we started slightly late, maybe 5 minutes. So I had a question for you, which comes from Aude Possida in the chat. I think we agree with her that rethinking training in terms of sustainable development means that we have to rethink what museums are, rethink about the positioning of museums and how they are developed in museums, and what we've heard from our 4 speakers tonight, we've seen that very clearly. So a question for each of you, with just a very quick answer. If you had one single action that you could put in, you could implement tomorrow in order to change the training in your different institutions where you are, what would you start with? So very quick answers, please. I think I would definitely start with research, because that's what's lacking most. Here we've been talking about managing museums and focus on the visitors, but in terms of research and academic capacity to produce articles on our own research, we have to rely on external expertise still for the moment. And there's a big gap here in terms of my perspective anyway. So I'd want to encourage research and communication, because you can see the rest of it, we're managing to do it, but this is something that we need to do. Ernest. Sorry, what was the question? If there was an action that you could put in place from tomorrow to renew training in Ivory Coast, what would you do? Where would you start? Well, we already have museology training programs, but I think we need to strengthen these with modules on sustainable development that are focused in on museums. So that's what I would do. Thank you very much. Michela? Michela? Or Manuela, do you hear it? Yes, I can answer. I would start definitely with interdisciplinarity. I think that training based on disciplines needs to be adapted in order to understand the cultural and natural environment around us, and all disciplines need to work together in this. So this brings us back to this circular approach that Michela mentioned, and she spoke first. Michela, would you have anything to say on this?
I agree with Manuelina for sure, and I think that it depends where you have to start these training sessions. I think that the participation with museums professional is really important, starting from masterclass training sessions, but immediately after having discussions and focus groups with them to really understand the critical points. So I think that this training followed by focus group can be helpful, and as the key point, really useful for museums.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. I think we're on time. I can't see any more questions. If you would like to have any more information on what's been presented by our colleagues, we can put you in touch with them, or we can send you the links for their respective institutions with regard to the examples presented today. I think that with Rita and Lena and Emily, I think we can say thank you very much for this evening and for these discussions. And we look forward to seeing you again. Emily, I'll hand over to you. Thank you, Hélène. Thank you, yes, ladies from ICTOP. You've led this evening really well. Thank you to all of our speakers, as you've just said. These have been some really excellent experiences that you presented. Thank you very much. So our next meeting is the 18th of October, same time, same place at 5:30. Sorry about the kids that you can hear behind me, perhaps. It's the time of day, I'm afraid. So the 18th of October at 5:30 French time, and we will have an ICOM Arab friends with us, and then we'll be on the 22nd of November with ICOM-CC. Thank you very much. Have a very good evening. Thanks for being with us and being faithfully following us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.